Hi, welcome to the video series for the Data Asset Weekly Dispatch newsletter. Each week, we send out this newsletter to hundreds and thousands of our users and our clients across the world to cover some of the more critical data stories that are impacting the world. At present, just like for many of you, what is being acutely felt is the impact of coronavirus or COVID-19 on not just our health, but also the way we live, our economy, our businesses, so on and so forth. And so this week we've kept the theme, just like last week, the overarching theme, if you may, of coronavirus. We will be taking you through 5 or 6 major stories related to data and how they're changing the way our world functions. Hopefully, by the end of this video, I would have given you some more insight, some more detail, and something to think about while you read this newsletter. But before I do that, I would request you to please go ahead, subscribe, share this video with your peers, your colleagues, and your friends, so that we could share this knowledge further and wider. So let's start. Throughout this video, I'm going to be referring to my notes and my laptop over there to talk to you about certain important points in each story. The first story is from the New York Times, and it's called "How much should the public know about who has the coronavirus?" And that's kind of a critical debate these days. Because while we are aggressively sharing information across progressive countries and developed countries and other countries who seem to be taking proactive steps when it comes to the pandemic, there are also issues about the privacy norms when it comes to patients. Many of us would have heard of situations and areas where people have either been ostracized or discriminated against when information was shared about them having potential exposure to coronavirus patients. If you think about it, all this data that we're collecting on cases, on suspected cases, on recovered patients, on unfortunate deaths, all that data is being aggregated and people have access to it. The concern here is that when you look at countries like the US, not only are the privacy norms the issue that the different states and different counties and different regions seem to be sharing this data in different formats and based on very different levels of sort of access and consistency. What this means is that one is not able to proactively fight the pandemic in specific areas, specific hotspots, but the other problem is also maybe too much information, too granular information is being shared. Now, this may not seem like a big problem right now, but in the US, there's a debate because a couple of things are happening. One, you've got countries like China, which though are aggressive in certain areas, are very progressive in certain areas. As far as data is concerned, they haven't been very transparent in sharing it, and that is potentially one of the reasons why the pandemic grew the way that it did. The second is Singapore, or even Taiwan, which is far more effective because they've been sharing data in an anonymized fashion, but very directly across all hospitals and across the medical fraternity. And then you've got the US, which is kind of in the middle, where certain states are very progressive and certain are not. But what this is really leading to is the fact that we are setting templates for two things. We're setting the template for the new normal of data, that it is okay now to share private data because for the greater good. And that's an interesting conversation to have. The second is that when there is a crisis, you are going to see, or rather we are going to see, a lot of data being shared, a lot of private data being shared at that point of time. And there have to be certain measures and areas and laws to ensure that it is not being misused. And that really is the summary of the first story, and it's a good read to sort of go through. Our second story is from India and about India. It's regarding a paper, a research paper that has recently been released called Age-Structured Impact of Social Distancing on the COVID-19 Epidemic in India. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but it's really by two authors, Ranaja Adhikari and Rajesh Singh, and they are from the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics from the University of Cambridge. The paper is not peer-reviewed, but what is important is that this paper seems to suggest that based on a new mathematical model that both these authors have worked on, 21 days lockdown, the current lockdown that's going on in India, is not going to be adequate to stem the flow or to stem the pandemic in the country. What they're suggesting is more like a 49-day lockdown, or shorter lockdown periods with certain respite in the middle, to completely close out some of the cases and to get the pandemic in control. This is kind of interesting because the growing opinion is that maybe 21 days may not be adequate for a country as diverse and as large as India, and this may be able to tell us as we move in the future how correct some of our predictions were, how correct some of our statisticians were, and how correct were some of our models when it comes to the real world impact of some of the work that is done in epidemiology. And I think from that point of view, it is quite interesting. It's a short article, but it gives you a good overview of what the maths says really in such a situation. Our third article is from open sourced and Vox, and really what it talks about is some of those phone companies who've been making applications and apps to measure and map social distancing. Now, why this is very important is because these apps are being used quite widely in today's date across different countries. They started off in China, they're now used in the US, they're being used in India, they've been used in Europe. And large companies like Facebook and Google and other large tech companies, they've been using an opt-in feature to get you to opt in to share your data so that you can get a good sense of how well are people managing social distancing within your little pin code, within your area, within your space. The problem is there are now other organizations where you're not really opting in for the data, but they're aggregating and collecting it from different applications that you would otherwise use, which you may have opted in for certain other purposes. And they're collecting that data without your permission, without your know-how, and using it to create social distancing maps. Now, they claim, as far as this article is concerned, that they're doing it for the greater good, but there are massive privacy norms and issues that seem to be flouted, but there is more evidence and there's more discussion required there. The problem is that effectively there are companies whom you never gave permission to, whom users never gave permission to, never gave access to, never possibly wanted to give access to, who currently have access to your location data, your geolocation data, and other related data points, which they are now aggregating and using for social distancing requirements and social distancing sort of solutions and products, but could easily be misused possibly in the future in other ways. And that's really our story number 3. Our next article is by Space News, and this article is about how the pandemic has really led to an uptick in demand for satellite images and satellite monitoring and tracking. The fundamental requirement here for many of these organizations is now that the pandemic has been sort of ravaging countries and societies and neighborhoods, how do you get a good measure of economic indicators of different countries and different places and different localities, especially when there's not a lot of reliable data that is being released on an ongoing basis. So these satellite images will give you a good indication of how many cars there are in parking lots, how many tankers are flowing from one location to the other, how much cement production is happening in a particular factory, how much mining is happening based on the number of trucks that are going in and going out of mining zones, things like that. The second requirement is to remotely manage and secure some of the assets that are there for many of these organizations and institutions. Usually meant sending people over, sending resources over to have a look to see whether these assets are secure, to see whether there's no problem. And these assets could be railway lines, could be oil rigs, could be factories, could be office buildings. But in today's date, when you can't really send people from one location to the other, you can't really fly them across the world. What many of these organizations are now doing is they're using satellite data to map these locations on a regular basis to give these organizations some comfort around how secure their assets are physically. And I thought that was a very interesting space for data to grow, especially in today's date when there's so much ambiguity and instability. Our fifth story is by Devix, and it's really a combination of a couple of stories that we've already done, which is the fact that this story is about how data mapping, especially around localities and communities, is very, very important, especially when you're trying to fight pandemics. And how that data mapping is done is by using geolocation data, by using local data, streets, addresses, satellite, and a combination of these things to be able to create an accurate map of some of the cities and localities where the pandemic is already there or maybe there. In the past, this approach of data mapping has kind of really helped out in, for example, when it came to the polio outbreak in India, in Bihar, and where an entire campaign had to be sort of managed to ensure that this vaccine for polio goes out to every household and every place in Bihar. Now, they couldn't do that because they suddenly realized that there were no maps. There were no maps for villages, there were no maps or reliable maps for villages and towns and localities. And so how do you reach out to people in an institutional manner when you don't know where they are? And this is really a problem, not so much for the developed world, but for the developing world, which is really most of where humanity lives in today's date. And so I think this approach that is in the article by Devix is very, very important when we are trying to look at proactive measures, when you're trying to look at reactive measures on actually stamping out the pandemic on ground. And that's really related to data mapping at a very localized, local level. And so that's our fifth story. Our sixth and last story for the week is not really a story or an article, but really a link to a resource, of a resource that I actually personally quite enjoy a lot, which is Our World in Data. And they've created a separate section, a separate place for looking at and visualizing some of the data and research around COVID-19. And this includes research, statistics, cases, visualizations. And you can look at them at a glance. You can look at it by country, you can look at it by timeline. There are various measures that are and facts that are kind of listed out in detail, whether they are on deaths, on testing, on case strategies, how many fatalities, what do certain definitions mean. And I think this is a very important research rather a resource for those of us who are looking at understanding the data and the information far better than what one would normally see in the media. I must stress here that the reason why this resource is also being included is because we believe that a lot of the information that is out there in the media, while very well-meaning, is also very simplistic. And there's a lot of nuance in how the world is dealing with the pandemic, and I think to be able to understand it, resources like the one on Our World in Data are going to be very critical. So that's our sixth story and the last story for the week. And that completes our roundup for this week and for Data Asset Weekly Dispatch. In the description below, you will see a link to our newsletters. Please go and read them. Please subscribe to them. You'll also see a link to our website. Please do subscribe, share it with your peers, share it with your colleagues. We'd love to see you back again as we try and go through some of these interesting stories every week. Also, please do follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And until next week, take care.